Tonight we ask a haunting question. What would your life be like if you lived in the Stone Age? Before we step into the shadows of the past, if you enjoy these whispers of history, please don't forget to subscribe and like the video to join our journey through time. Welcome. Tonight I'm going to take you to a very, very distant time. In today's story, we will embark together on a silent journey to the Stone Age, the most primitive yet defining period of humanity. If you're currently in a soft bed with a warm blanket under your hands, during this narrative you'll feel the value of that comfort once again. Because in the world we're going to talk about today, forget blankets, even shelter was considered a luxury. Now close your eyes because we're beginning. To the beginning of time, to an era when roads, writing, the wheel, even agriculture didn't yet exist. Thousands of years ago, the world wasn't like today. Forests were vast, the sky darker, nights quieter and more frightening. And humans, in the middle of nature, in their most vulnerable state, were trying to survive. Can you imagine spending a winter without a home? For someone living in the Stone Age, this wasn't just imagination, it was reality. Because what we call a home wasn't yet a standardized structure. People lived in caves or made temporary shelters from tree branches. There was no warm stove. If it rained, you got wet. If the wind blew, it would move stones from their place. And the cold, such cold that it would seep into your bones. Food? Today, when we're hungry, we turn to the refrigerator or phone. But in the Stone Age, hunger was a reality that walked hand in hand with death. They would set out early in the morning to find prey. Sometimes no food would be found for days. Gathering plants was risky too, because you didn't know which fruit was poisonous, which was edible. You only trusted what you heard from your mother or the elders of your tribe. But one wrong step could result in death. Nights were a completely different ordeal. A group of people gathered around the fire would listen to the sounds of the night. Wolf howls, footsteps coming from afar, unknown animal screams. When you fell asleep, there was always the possibility of not waking up, because you had no walls around you, no alarm systems, just a darkness awaiting the night and the unknowns within it. Clothes? There was no sewing machine like today. You would try to cover your body with animal hides, carving holes with stones. But when these hides got wet, they would become damp, and combined with the wind could make you sick. And of course, there was no medicine. Even a toothache would turn into days of pain. Even a small cut could weaken you. People would wake up every day facing a new threat: hunger, disease, wild animals, attacks from other tribes, or nature itself. But still they lived. They stayed standing. They carved stones. They discovered fire. They told each other their stories. And that's why we're here. Tonight, I want to convey to you not just by telling, but by making you feel why that life was difficult. Because history isn't hidden in pages, but in the nights people lived through. The morning frost had settled between the stones. The sky was gray. The trees were silent. The mist left over from the night was spreading slowly over the ground, and a small group of people lay curled up on that stone ground before waking. They had neither blankets over them nor four walls. Just cold stone, pieces of hide, and the sound of the wind. If you had opened your eyes that morning, this is what you would have heard first. That deep howl the wind made passing through the branches, and the smell of soot entering through your nose. A reminder from the last embers of the fire that burned through the night. Mornings in the Stone Age were silent, but this silence came not from peace, but from deprivation. Waking up inside a house was a dream for that period. There were no walls, no ceiling. You weren't born into something. You were born in the middle of nature, at its mercy. Making shelter wasn't a luxury for Stone Age people. It was the most basic condition of survival. But what we call shelter wasn't a solid four-walled structure in today's sense. Sometimes under a rock, sometimes a primitive shelter created by a few branches leaning against each other. How much that shelter would protect you depended entirely on chance. If the wind changed direction, your night could be wet. If the rain had started, you should have been prepared already. Otherwise, you would have to stay awake all night, because lying on the ground could make you sick. There was a young woman named Sarah. She hadn't even reached 20 yet, but the lines on her face already resembled someone in their 40s. For one night, she had tried to sleep with her children at a point close to the cave entrance. The fire had gone out. Her youngest child was shivering, curled up somewhere, silently waiting. Sarah was awake, because a mother had no luxury of sleep in those conditions. She was just listening to the speed of the wind, the smell of rain, the animal sounds outside. The cave protected, perhaps, but the cave was also dangerous, dark, damp, sometimes poisonous. For those who couldn't find a cave, the only solution was to race against nature. Tree branches, animal hides, stones, all would be used, but none would give confidence. Today, in a house you enter, you lock your door. You have rain-proof windows. You have heating to warm the inside. But in that period, you would hope that a stone's correct angle would shield you. In the Stone Age, making shelter was not just a physical, but a mental struggle. Because with every wind, the question of, will it collapse tonight, would never leave your mind. Cold was the biggest enemy. It didn't just fail to warm, it also silenced. It would make people unable to speak, unable to move. You would clasp your hands together, curl your body, hold your breath inside, trying to preserve warmth, and meanwhile, you would pray. To whatever God was believed in during that period. Maybe I'll see the morning. Because morning was always a victory. Where there was no shelter, sleep was half. Because one of your ears was outside. Even the sound of a leaf could startle you. Bears, wolves, snakes all wandered outside. You were considered to have entered their territory. Every night wasn't in a shelter, but a challenge spent in the middle of nature. That's why people slept together. Someone's eyes always had to stay open. This wasn't a rule, it was instinct. The materials for making shelter were stone and wood, but what was really needed was time. And time was the most precious thing for Stone Age people. Because when the sun set, you couldn't work. Nights were the enemy. Though daytime seemed sufficient for hunting, gathering, walking, it was actually always lacking. Before finishing a shelter, snow could fall, a storm could arise, or another tribe could find you. And sometimes you had to leave your entire shelter behind and go. Because water had run out, prey had ended, trees had dried up. Attaching yourself to a shelter would endanger survival. That's why people always lived halfway. Everything they made was temporary. No structure was complete, and no structure would last forever. That's why one of the hardest things in the Stone Age was the feeling of security. There was no roof. There was no lock either. No table, no chair, no window. There were only stones and bodies. And when these bodies got cold at night, the line between life and death became very thin. If you had lived in that period, shelter would be not just comfort, but a miracle. And you had to rebuild that miracle every night. That's why in the Stone Age, life was first tested by shelter. Because without shelter, there was no life. What you can reach in a few steps when you go to your kitchen today, perhaps the slight unease you feel when an ordinary meal is delayed. But in the Stone Age, hunger wasn't just a feeling. It was a threat. Like a silent but merciless shadow, it would walk with people every day, sometimes not even leaving the strength to breathe. And most of the time, hunger would test not one person, but an entire tribe at once. That morning, the sky was hazy and motionless. The ground was damp, but not muddy enough to be unable to walk on. A few men from the tribe had set out early for hunting. With them were stone-tipped spears, a few flint stones, a knife, and hope. Because for 3 days no large animal had been seen. Just a few lizards, a few withered fruits. But these neither satisfied hunger nor fed the children. When entering the forest, the silence would become more pronounced. Even birds wouldn't sing most of the time, because animals sensed the presence of humans and had learned to stay away. Hunting was a matter of luck. Sometimes you would walk for hours, not finding a single footprint. Sometimes you would see a deer, but if the direction changed with the wind, it would smell you and escape. Then the spears would have been carried in vain. Today was one of those days. In the forest there was neither sound nor trace. As the sun rose, hope also diminished. Backs were sweaty. Stomachs were empty. But hunger shouldn't be thought of as only physical. In the Stone Age, hunger also gnawed at the mind. The weight of not being able to feed your children for another day would sit like stone on the hunter's back. When returning to the tribe, faces would tell everything without saying anything. Eyes would look at the ground. Women would understand. Children couldn't ask. There was no food that day. Maybe there wouldn't be tomorrow either. And this wasn't just an empty stomach. It was the petrified form of helplessness. Women would begin digging around the soil, hoping perhaps we'll find some roots. Some children would search for fish by the riverbank, but entering the cold water required courage. And sometimes nothing would be found, nothing at all. Hunger was like a silent guest. It was quiet, but there. And when people were hungry, they would speak less. Eyes would slow, steps would become heavy, sleep would be light. Because deep sleep wasn't possible with an empty stomach. When night came, hunger's echo would be in the bones. Some would see food in their dreams, hot meat, cooked fish, sweet fruits. When they woke up in the morning, there would only be an empty stone plate and a fire pit full of ash in front of them, and hunger would win again. Sometimes, when prey was found, there would be a festive atmosphere in the tribe. But that meat wouldn't be consumed immediately. It would be divided into small pieces. Even without salt, attempts would be made to dry it in the sun. Because the possibility of going hungry again the next day was always there. Hunger would begin anew every day in the Stone Age, and every day the struggle against it would be reborn. The hunter's success wouldn't just fill stomachs. It would ensure making it through another night. That's why living in the Stone Age meant constantly trying to find, and most of the time, hunger would prevail. Mornings in the Stone Age were always early. Before the sun's first light touched the horizon, some would have already woken. Because getting water took time. Whether that water was hot or cold didn't matter. That it was clean wasn't guaranteed either. What mattered was that it was there. Because every sip to be drunk throughout the day, every stone to be carried, everything to be cooked depended on those few drops. If there was a river near the tribe, you were lucky, but most of the time this wasn't possible. Settlement would be determined according to animal paths, hunting areas. Water would sometimes be far outside these paths. Then, kilometers would be walked several times a day. With you would be a stone container, a sagging pouch made from animal hide. When water touched your hand, you wouldn't want to drink that water immediately, because carrying it was harder and every drop was valuable. But no one could know whether that water was clean. An animal passing through the river from above might have left disease where it drank. A swampy bend might have silently added dirt to the water, but there was no choice. That water would be drunk. And sometimes this would result in stomach aches lasting several days, sometimes with something worse. What we call microscopic today wasn't known then, but its effects were felt. If fever rose after drinking water, this was called water poison. There was no cure. If someone's insides were burning, the only thing to do was lay them in the shade and pray. Because there was no medicine, no knowledge either, only silence. Carrying water was mostly women's and children's work. On their backs would be bags made from animal hide. When those bags got wet, they would become heavier, and water would leak while carrying. Only a few handfuls would remain, but those few handfuls of water could boil a soup or wet children's mouths. Dry seasons were the most difficult. When the ground cracked, even the sound of water would be forgotten. People would dig stones in dried riverbeds. Maybe some moisture would come out from underneath. Some would keep stones in their mouths, trying to produce saliva and resist thirst, because without water, humans couldn't even think. When night came, the lack of water would make itself felt more. Even if fire burned, thirst wouldn't stop burning. Drying lips, cracking mouth corners, and drawn-in breaths would all pray for a drop of water, and most of the time, that prayer would carry over to the next day. Sometimes, rain would be a miracle. People would open their hands, turn their mouths to the sky. Hides, containers, hollows in stones, everything would turn into water containers. Because in the Stone Age, water was a gift from the sky. But when it would come wasn't certain. That's why an entire day would sometimes be lived just to find water. Because without water, life would stop. When night fell, the air would change suddenly. The soil that carried the sun's warmth during the day would take on an icy hardness with darkness. The wind would pass through the branches like a whistle, hitting the surface of stones, producing a howl that seeped inside. And that howl wasn't just a nature sound for Stone Age people. It was a warning. Cold was beginning. Fire wasn't yet something every tribe could easily light. Most of the time, stone would be struck against stone. Dry grass would be rubbed patiently. Sparks would be awaited. But if there was wind, the spark would extinguish and go. If it had rained, the grass would have become damp. Then that night would pass without fire. This also meant the body would get cold. Hands would become numb. Sleep would be interrupted. Cold would be not just outside, but inside too. People lying between stone walls and caves wouldn't hear the wind, but would feel the stone's coldness in their bones. What they had to cover themselves with was limited to a few animal posts. But posts would harden over time, let water through. A wet post was more harm than good. On cold nights, the most done thing was to get close to each other, to warm with body heat, silently, trembling as if praying. Sometimes there was fire, but no wood to burn it. Finding dry branches was also difficult, because the closer you were, the more depleted were the surrounding resources. For this reason, some nights would be spent not by the fire, but with the dream of fire. Cold affected children more, because their bodies were small. They couldn't hold heat. Mothers would press their children to their chests, try to warm them with their breaths. But if there was no fire, this wouldn't be enough either. A night spent in the cold meant waking up the next morning with a sicker child, perhaps not waking up at all. In some regions, snow would fall, but snow wasn't just a white cover, but a silent danger. It would cover everything, suppress noise, but make breathing difficult. Cold air seeping into the shelter would draw everyone inside into silence, because even speaking in the cold was tiring. Lips would crack, breath would become visible. Making sound would chill your insides. In those nights, time would pass more slowly. Minutes would stretch. Hours would seem endless. If someone woke in the middle of the night, they would feel for the fire with their hands. Was there still an ember? If so, it would immediately be revived with breath. A few branch pieces would be added. Reviving the fire could get a family through to morning. But if the fire had never burned, then the night would be not just cold, but a silent ordeal, and morning would begin only for those who survived. That's why, in the Stone Age, cold wasn't just a season, but an enemy that came anew every day. Without fire, hope was also weak, because warming wasn't the only way to survive, but to believe in survival. In the Stone Age, fire wasn't just heat. Fire was a gleam that split through the night. It was like hope in the middle of darkness, and one spark meant one life. But lighting that spark wasn't with the sound of a lighter like today, but with patience, skill, and a bit of luck. People would strike stones against each other, separate dry grass fiber by fiber, create a handful with their hands, and try to take that tiny spark inside and make it grow. But most of the time this effort would be in vain, because the wind would erase everything with a single breath, or moisture had already rotted the inside of the grass. Then it would be started again with patience, and hours of attempts would be made to light a fire again. Sometimes hands would form scabs, stones would cut hands, but still it wouldn't be given up. Because if fire didn't burn, night would be dark. Food wouldn't cook, there would be no warmth, and most importantly, animals would approach. The burning of fire wasn't just about warming or lighting. It was a sign that a tribe could stay standing. A group with fire was strong. A shelter with fire burning would tell others there is life here. But if the spark didn't come, everything would merge into silence. There were some nights when everything was ready, but the spark wouldn't come. And those nights, the silence would be deeper. People would huddle together, hold their breaths, and wait. Maybe we'll try again in the morning with the sun. Because struggling with wet grass at night, showing patience while tired and hungry, wasn't easy. Fire was considered sacred over time. The person who lit it would be respected in the tribe, because it wasn't just a flame, it was people's will to cope with darkness. Those with fire would tell stories, sing songs, keep children safe. But if there was no fire, that night was silent. Perhaps prayer wouldn't even be said, because cold, fear, and darkness would silence even words. When morning came and the sun rose, still being alive after a night spent without fire would be considered a small victory. But everyone would know that the next night would again require a spark, and maybe this time it wouldn't come either. After the sun set, life in the Stone Age wouldn't stop. It would just change shape. The busy crowd of daytime would give way to the silence of night. People gathered by the fire would withdraw one by one into their shells. Shadows would begin to mix together. But precisely at these hours, another life would begin. Under the moonlight, on bare ground, in the depths of the forest, other beings with gleaming eyes would awaken. Bears, wolves, jackals, silently advancing snakes, all were masters of the night. And humans were the most vulnerable beings in this silence. Tribes would never sleep completely at night. There would always be a guard. Sometimes this would be an old man, Though his eyes couldn't see, his ears were sharp enough to sense the steps of a hunting wolf. Sometimes, a young child whose mother had recently died would try to keep his head upright, keeping his first watch. But whoever it was, someone would definitely stay awake throughout the night, because those who didn't stay awake might not see the morning. Fire was people's greatest defense against the night. A few pieces of wood placed among branches in ember state would give not just warmth, but confidence. In the firelight, eyes would gleam, bodies would become shadows. But noticing that the fire was diminishing was the guard's greatest responsibility. Because as light diminished, shadows would grow, animals would approach, and to stop an approaching animal required timely intervention. A guard could sometimes protect the entire tribe just by blowing on a spark. The hardest moment of the watch was midnight. Nature would completely fall silent. Even the wind would stop. In that silence, even the smallest sound could be a threat. Or it was just a dry branch piece playing with the wind. But understanding this required instinct, because humans survived not with nature's teaching, but with intuition. One night, old Torgen was on watch. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were still agile. Sitting by the fire, he was stirring the embers with the short stick in his hand. That night, the sky was overcast. The moon wasn't visible. Shadows in the firelight were more frightening. The tribe's children were sleeping, a silent, heavy sleep. Torgen listened carefully. A branch broke. Not far away, not too close either. Maybe it was a fox. Maybe it was a wolf. He put his stick on the ground. He reached his hands toward the stones. If necessary, he should be ready to make noise. But he was patient. Waking the tribe with every sound of the night would bring not confidence, but fear. A few minutes later, another sound. But this time, the distance between two steps was too long. This wasn't a fox. Something was coming that night. He revived the fire. A few sparks flew. The sky was dark, but Torgen's eyes were accustomed to piercing the darkness. Without making eye contact, he saw it. A large wolf, hungry and not alone. The wolf approached. It didn't enter the firelight, but smelled. Instinct said there were living things behind the warmth. But fire was there. Fire was a deterrent. Torgen didn't get up from his place. He continued stirring the fire. Body language was calm but attentive. The wolf waited a while longer. Then it retreated. He never forgot that moment. That night's morning, the tribe silently greeted Torgen by the fire. Nothing was said, but everyone sensed something had happened that night. Some nights there would be attacks. Sometimes not animals, but those from other tribes would come. But animal danger was more unpredictable. Wolves would come in packs, approach silently. Snakes would crawl right into the shelter. That's why the guard had to watch not just outside, but inside too. Children's breathing, elders coughing, he had to be aware of everything. Watches would change. The night would be divided into 3. Everyone would take their turn. But some were more suited to watching. Young men would see the night as hunting time, be on alert. Women would sacrifice their most sleepless times to protect their children. Everyone would stay awake for their own reason. But what was common was that every night was a battle, a silent battle, against darkness, against nature, against sleep. Some guards would talk to the night. They would murmur to themselves, pray, make silent agreements with the gods. May this night pass. May nothing happen to anyone. These prayers were often enough for a child to reach morning. But some nights that prayer wouldn't be enough. In the morning, a piece of post would be missing by the fire, a trace, a bloodstain. There would be moments when the watch broke, and then silence would descend on the tribe like morning. But most of the time, guards would do their duty. They would resist sleep, endure darkness, not close their eyes. Because they knew that the eyes they kept open allowed others to close their eyes safely. Watch wasn't just a responsibility, but a demonstration of loyalty. And when morning came, when the sun rose, everyone who woke would first look at the guard. Were those eyes open? Was the fire still burning? If the answer was yes, that night had been won. That's what not sleeping at night in the Stone Age was like. Not luxury, but necessity. Not rest, but resistance. Because the darkness of night wasn't just darkness. Inside it were sounds, threats, shadows, and gazes watching without eye contact. Humans didn't just fight during the day. The deepest struggle was the most silent one. And that struggle was waged in watches kept at night, won with silence. Being sick in the Stone Age wasn't a situation that corresponded with a diagnosis, a prescription, or a doctor in today's sense. Being sick was taking a step back in the delicate balance with nature, and most of the time that one step could turn into a cliff. Because in the face of illness, you had neither medicine nor knowledge in your hands. There was only patience, prayer, and nature's mercy. Sometimes it would happen. Someone would wake up one morning with a cough. Maybe they caught wind left over from night. Maybe the river water was too cold. Maybe it was something with an unknown cause. But if the cough increased, eyes would turn to the elders in the tribe. With their wisdom, they would show some leaves, some flowers. But nothing was certain, because in nature there was as much poison as there was healing. And understanding the difference required not years, but sometimes a sacrifice. When fever rose, people would think the gods were angry. The body would burn, consciousness would cloud, mouth would dry, hands would tremble. Most of the time, the sick person would be laid in the shade. Animal hides would be placed over them. Someone would be seated beside them. That person would listen to the patient's breath, wipe their sweat, sometimes hold their head throughout the night. Because a body that fell wouldn't rise easily. Wounds were even more dangerous. A cut would be wrapped not with stitches and antiseptic like today, but only with a piece of cloth and grass. But infection was insidious. The first day, nothing would be apparent. Then redness, then swelling, then fever, and then days spent in pain, then silence. Children were the most vulnerable. Teething, diarrhea, shortness of breath. Even the smallest symptoms could turn into great losses. Mothers would hold their children's foreheads in their palms, cling tightly to trembling bodies, praying all night, not crying, just watching, because helplessness would settle most in mothers' eyes. When elders got sick, it was quieter, because they were aware of this cycle. Some would prepare for their own death, give advice to the young. If the fever rises too much, carry me outside, they would say, so it doesn't spread to others. Because illness would sometimes spread not to a single body, but to the tribe. Contagious ones were the most feared. One person weakening would put others at risk. Shelters were narrow. There was no such thing as distance. That's why sick people would sometimes be taken outside the cave, alone in the cold, but to protect others. This loneliness was often the first step of death. Few would return. In a tribe there was an old woman. Her name was Sarah. Everyone would consult her. She knew plants, would make mixtures. But even she would sometimes shake her head and say, "There's nothing we can do about this." Because knowledge was limited and nature would sometimes remain silent. Illnesses would often come without a reason. Mosquitoes increasing after a rainy season, dirty water drunk from the river, bacteria carried by hunted animals. All were invisible, but their effects were frightening. People would explain this situation as the wrath of unseen spirits. If spirits were angry, the body would become sick. That's why not only physical healing would be sought, spiritual healing was also needed. Ceremonies would be held. Dancing would occur around the fire. Shamans would whisper prayers, but some prayers wouldn't be heard. Some mornings, one body would be missing when waking. And death in the Stone Age. Death wasn't an unusual thing. Everyone had gotten used to living with it. But death from illness was different. It was silent. It would approach slowly. First, eyes would dim, then the body would grow cold. People would watch this transition with respect. Because illness wasn't an honor like dying in war, it was falling behind in the race with nature. The deceased would be silently given to the earth. Stones would be lined up on top. Afterward, for a while, conversations in the tribe would decrease. Nights would pass more inwardly. That's what being sick in the Stone Age was like. A waiting where what to do wasn't fully known, but what could be done was done. There was neither a physician nor a prescription. Only hands, eyes, and hearts. And the greatest burden those hearts carried was helplessness. Life in the Stone Age was kneaded with difficulty in every breath. But perhaps the most silent, most lonely, and deepest test was birth. The miracle that occurs today in sterile hospitals, accompanied by expert hands, machines, and medicines, was lived thousands of years ago only between a trembling body on a few animal posts in a corner of a cave and silently watching eyes. There was no hygiene, no guarantee, and most of the time, the one giving birth was as close to death as the one being born. As birth approached, there would be a silence in the tribe. Women would notice first from the mother's walk, her breathing, her sleeplessness at night. Then one morning, the woman would silently withdraw to the edge of the shelter. One or two old women would come to her side. Others would stay away. Men would be sent away. Because birth was a secret. It was sacred, something feared. The emergence of another body from inside the body would arouse as much unease as admiration. There was no special place prepared for birth in the shelter. A corner, some dry grass, a few clean posts. That was all. When birth would begin wasn't known. It could last days. When contractions came, the woman would silently surrender to the pain. Screaming could attract animals. That's why lips would be bitten, hands would be buried in the ground. Pain would grow from within, and with each wave, the woman would become a bit more alone. The helping old women would sometimes just hold hands, sometimes pray, because in their hands was neither medicine nor knowledge, only experience and instinct. First births were harder. The young body wasn't ready. With contractions, fear would appear in the eyes. The mother's breathing would quicken. Sweat would drip from her forehead. Hands would grow cold. Eyes would sometimes fix on the ground, sometimes into space. Everything would both last very long and pass like a breath all at once. When a baby was born, there would be silence. Because breath was awaited, crying was awaited. Until that sound came, no one would relax. But if that sound came, small joy would be born in the shelter. At that moment, one more life had begun. But in every birth, that sound wouldn't come. Sometimes the baby would be motionless. Sometimes the mother would lose blood. The ground would become bright red at that moment. Hands couldn't reach. Cloth wasn't enough. Knowledge wasn't enough. Birth was as much the sibling of death as it was the beginning of life. In the Stone Age, many children would grow up without mothers. Many mothers wouldn't see the child they gave birth to, and this situation would be considered normal, because people believed this was nature's order. The absence of hygiene meant infections entering through the door. Wounded womb, uncleaned hands, dirty water, all could silently bring death. But no one in the tribe would know this. They would just say she couldn't carry the birth, and the earth would take one more body inside. A woman who emerged from birth safely wouldn't be greeted like a hero. But everyone would look into her eyes with more respect, because she had passed the greatest test and had survived. In the tribe, after every birth, there would be a brief period of silence, because everyone was aware of something. This miracle had raced with death every time, and sometimes who won, who lost, wasn't even clear. But when morning came, the newborn baby would be wrapped somewhere in the shelter. If the mother could wake up, her head would be caressed, and life would continue as if nothing had happened, until the next birth. In the Stone Age, cold wasn't just a season. It was like a wall, a force descending upon humans, seeping into bones, freezing breath. The weather that today we get through with a coat, with a sweater, in those days determined the line between life and death, because what would cover the body had turned from a design into a survival tool. And how durable that tool was often limited to what you tore from nature. There were no clothes. Fabric wasn't known, neither cotton nor linen. Only animal posts, dried hides, and sometimes bark. When an animal was hunted, meat would be eaten, bones would become tools. But the most valuable part was its hide, because that hide was the only protection against cold throughout winter. But not every hide would be used. Thin ones would tear easily. Thick ones wouldn't allow movement. That's why a good hide depended on both the hunter's success and the knowledge of the one processing the hide. Posts wouldn't be directly covered over the body. First, they would be scraped. Fur would be removed or left. They would be dried in the sun, hardened with smoke. Some would even chew it to soften it. Then holes would be made with stones, with bones. Strings made from animal intestines would be passed through these holes, knotted, and turned into a garment. What we call sewing in those days was just a thread and a hole. But if that hole wasn't opened properly, wind would seep in, cold would begin from the inside. When winter came, wind would be more merciless. Shelters were of stone and earth, but had many openings. That's why people would spend almost the entire day with their clothes on. Posts would be spread on the bed at night, worn in the morning, put back on. But these clothes would never provide complete protection. Wind would enter from exposed parts of the skin, advance to knees, neck, and between hands. The hardest thing was struggling with wetness. A hide wet in the rain would become heavy, lose its flexibility, and become ice cold. A wet post wasn't clothing, it was punishment. Children would be wrapped in small posts, but most of the time their hands would remain exposed. Their feet would be bare. For this reason, children's toes would constantly freeze. Mothers would warm their feet with their hands, wrap their bodies with their own warmth. But this was also temporary. Cold wouldn't end. It would begin anew every day. Posts also had a smell, because they couldn't be cleaned sufficiently. The animal's skin would smell over time. Especially when wet, it would worsen. But no one paid attention to smell, because surviving meant accepting every discomfort. Smell, flies, hardness, all were the price of living. When night came, posts would be shared. Not everyone would have one. That's why sleeping together was obligatory. Bodies' heat would unite. The post would become more effective. Sometimes one post would cover 3 people, but in the morning one would wake up colder. The one who pulled the post would survive. The one who couldn't pull would shiver. A well-processed hide was valuable in the tribe. It would even be bartered. The hunter's success, as much as the processor's skill, would be respected. With hide, hats, boots, belts would be made. But these weren't decorations, but survival tools. And the effort put into each would be measured not in hours, but in days. Some tribes would decorate hides. With stones, with bone pieces, they would create patterns. But this decoration wasn't beauty, it was an identity. It would show which tribe, which region's people. Recognizing the post was recognizing the person. But what was most sought after was thick and sturdy, because one wind would make you forget all decoration, only remind you of warmth. And yet, no matter how good the post, the battle with cold was never fully won. Every night when lying down, people would pray, "May this night not be too cold." Because in the morning, some wouldn't wake up. Freezing to death was silent. Even the person next to you wouldn't notice. Perhaps their breath would just vaporize a bit less, and that would be understood. One more person had remained alone inside the post. When a storm was approaching in the Stone Age, first the sky would speak. Clouds would gather, wind would change direction. Birds would fall silent. Trees would whisper something with rustling. After that whisper, silence would come. But this silence wasn't peace. It was nature's last warning. And then the first drop would fall onto the ground silently. Maybe onto a leaf. Maybe onto a stone's back. But with that first drop, everyone would know. How solid the shelter was would soon be revealed. In the Stone Age, shelters weren't luxury. They were temporary, weak, and most of the time defenseless against nature. Thick branches placed on a few stones, the top covered with animal hide, the gaps stuffed with dry grass were the structures. There was no door, no window. They were built only to protect from cold, from wind, and sometimes from curious eyes. But when rain came, the shelter's boundaries would quickly become apparent. Hide would stretch, grass would leak, water would flow between stones. Then inside and outside would become the same. If the rain was light, it would be endured. People would wrap themselves in blankets, in posts, try to protect the fire, hold children. But if the rain was determined, patience wouldn't work. Then the bottom of the shelter would become mud. Beds would get wet. Fire would start to go out. Wetness wasn't just discomfort for Stone Age people. It was a serious threat. Because once you got wet, cold would find you. And when you got wet, drying your clothes wasn't possible. If the fire had gone out, hope would also go out. Storm was worse. Rain coming with wind would bring not just water, but destruction. Branches would creak, shelter would collapse, stones would move from their places, animal hides would be tossed by the wind, Water flooding inside would quickly turn everything to mud. In such a storm, staying inside wouldn't be possible. Going outside wasn't a solution either. But most of the time, nature would be faced head-on. People would huddle together. Children would be taken between bodies. Women would cover the elders. The most enduring would stay on the outside. The weakest would be taken to the center. Because survival passed through protecting each other. Taking shelter under a tree was a solution, but dangerous. Though lightning fear wasn't known, the possibility of trees falling would be sensed. That's why seeking cover was necessary. Caves, bottoms of rocks, stone outcrops, every place would become temporary hope. But wet ground, water seeping from inside the rock, everything would slowly seep into the body. Feet would freeze, hands would go numb, eyes would begin to close, and then the only thing to do was wait. People wouldn't talk much in these moments. The storm would speak loudly enough with nature's voice anyway. The sky would thunder. A woman hiding behind a stone would close her eyes and pray inside, "May it pass." Sometimes this waiting would last hours, sometimes a night, and sometimes when morning came, one body would be missing when waking. Children would be afraid of storms, but fear would turn into silence over time. Because when experienced again and again, humans would learn to use even emotions sparingly. The most afraid would sometimes be the most silent. A little girl wrapped in her mother's skirt would sit at the base of a stone wall, not raising her eyes to the sky, not crying. Even tears were unnecessary, because everything was already wet. Shelters would sometimes completely collapse. Then they would need to be rebuilt. But after rain, the ground would be mud. Trees would become heavy. If hide was wet, it couldn't be used, and everyone would be tired. But still, someone would come out and carry stones. Someone would bring branches. Because without shelter, there would be no night. And night in the Stone Age was still the greatest fear. After some storms, the tribe would have to relocate. Because ground would collapse, roads would close, waters would rise. Nature would behave as if to say, "You can't live here anymore," and people would silently accept. Helplessness was a learned virtue. Small children would sleep on their mothers' backs while belongings were carried. Men would walk in front with posts on their backs, stone tools in their hands. Even though the storm had ended, its effect wouldn't pass easily. In the Stone Age, a storm wasn't just weather. It was a reminder of how fragile life was. When morning came, the sun would emerge. Water would begin to evaporate. Hides would be tried to be dried, shelter would be repaired again, and people would look at each other. How many people missing? How many people alive? The question would be silently asked. One more storm had passed, but every storm would leave a trace. On the post, at the edge of stone, in the look in eyes. And most importantly, until the next storm, there might be plenty of time, but no one would trust this. Every moment of life in the Stone Age was like a bargain with nature. You had need, but nature didn't want to give. You had to take. But you had neither a ready chisel in your hand, nor a knife, nor a hammer. Everything had to be made from scratch. And that thing we call even a simple knife we'd buy from a store today was a struggle requiring days of attention, effort, and patience back then. A tool was needed to do a job. To cut meat, to skin a hunted animal, to tear apart hide, to build shelter, even to break up food. But no one was producing that tool for you. You had to take it from nature and shape it. This also meant first you would find stone. Not every stone would work. hardness, fragility, sharpness. These determined the stone's workability. The most preferred were stones like flint that were hard and smooth-surfaced. But finding these stones wasn't easy. The right stone's trace, shape, color was different. A stone master would see a good stone from afar, but an amateur would sometimes struggle with the wrong stone for a whole day. Everything would begin with striking two stones against each other. But this wasn't just any collision. It was a careful move. The angle needed to be adjusted well. If you hit too hard, the stone would crack. If too light, it wouldn't shape. Controlled blows were needed from the right angle at the right point. The first kilogram, the first break, and then gradually edges beginning to take shape. Over time, sharpness would emerge from inside the stone. That shapeless mass would turn into a knife or scraper. But this was just the beginning. If that stone piece was to be of use, you needed to find a handle. For the handle, tree bark, bone, or a straight branch could be used. Opening a hole in the middle of the stone was nearly impossible. That's why it needed to be tied. For binding, dried animal intestines, fibers, or post pieces would be used. If knots weren't tied tightly, the stone would move out of place. The tool would become useless. In short, rope was as important as stone, and patience was as important as rope. Success on the first try was rare. Many stones would break. If the edge was carved too much, sharpness would be lost. If symmetry was disrupted, it wouldn't work. But every failure would lead to a new attempt, because you had no other choice. Without a tool, you couldn't cut meat. If you couldn't cut, it would spoil. If you couldn't skin the hide, you couldn't make clothing. So making tools wasn't just a manual skill. It was the foundation of survival. Even after everything was completed, the problem wouldn't end. The tool could break. If dropped, it would crack. If wet, it would come undone. If the stone's edge dulled, it needed to be carved again. That's why every stone tool was also a temporary companion. It wasn't permanent. One day it would save you. The next day it could shatter in your hand. This also meant you had to start over every day. Some people would master tool making. They would be respected in the tribe, because with the scrapers they made, hide could be better stripped. With their axe, sturdier branches would be cut. But these people had also learned over time. Each had shattered countless stone pieces, cut their fingers, injured their hands, because mastery came not with time, but with repetition. Children would also begin playing with stones at a young age. They had no toys, but taking one stone and hitting it against another stone was their most natural game. Over time, hands would get used to it. Eyes would learn to measure. Blows would be balanced. This was knowledge passed from generation to generation, but not verbal, silent. Stone with stone would speak. Humans would understand that language over time. The shape of stone tools would change according to the geography where people lived. Some would make pointed tips, some would make flat and wide ones, because every region's need was different. While one made arrowheads for hunting, another would produce scrapers for digging. This also showed how harmoniously humans lived with nature. Everything would be shaped according to need. There was no luxury, no decoration, only function. However, over time, some stone tools would also begin to be decorated. Scratches on the edge, patterns on the grip. Maybe it was just for aesthetics, or maybe it was a sign of belonging. So it would be clear whose it was, so others wouldn't interfere. Because every stone tool was needed with its owner's labor. And perhaps the most important thing was this: The breaking of a tool wasn't just the loss of an item. It was the disruption of a rhythm. Going out on hunting day without a tool meant returning empty. It meant going hungry.
That's why people would check their tools first thing in the morning, tighten the handle, renew the ropes. Because if the stone left you halfway that day, nature wouldn't be merciful. That's what carving stone with stone in the Stone Age was like. It required both strength, patience, and instinct. Attention with every blow, courage to start over with every break. Because to cope with nature, you first needed to resemble it. And as hard as nature was, human hands had to be that determined. Time passed. Nights, months, seasons. Those sitting by the fire changed. Children grew up. Elders silently passed. But those stories remained. Though not carved in stones, they were carved in hearts. In every silent walk, in every careful breath, in every attentive gaze, the past reminded itself. And humans perhaps learned this most. Dying was inevitable, but being forgotten wasn't. To leave a trace, there was no need to shout. Living silently was the simplest but most effective way to leave a trace. Because those truly remembered weren't those who spoke most, but those who lived most deeply. After all, the Stone Age isn't a history, but a state of consciousness. It's the history of living not against, but with nature, of making do with less, of resisting like stone in difficult times while remaining silent. And if we're talking about them today, we owe this to their silence, because they didn't shout, but they lived. And living is sometimes a much louder sound than shouting. The fire is going out now. The sound of night is increasing. Stories have been heard. Hardships have been understood. And even thousands of years later, we still carry the same question inside us. What does it really mean to be strong in this life? Perhaps the single and most correct answer that Stone Age people gave was this: to resist silently. Good night.